Welcome to Part 3 of the Evolution of Civilization, the Story of Life. I often begin discussing topics by starting with etymologies and definitions. In this case, the definition of life includes various functions such as metabolism, growth, reproduction, response to stimuli, or adaptation to the environment. But in this case, it's a little too stale. So we're not going to stop and fuss about the sterile names of biology, or be so specific that it diverts from the story. Rather, we'll use interesting overlays that evoke the more fundamental aspects of the story of life, to appreciate the mere existence of life, here, now, because we are the latest incarnation of this process. The story of life is not just the most amazing story ever told, but it's the reason why we're here right now, why this voice exists, and why you are here to listen. The miracle of life and all its diversity is the thing that gives rise to the miracle of consciousness, which allows us to have language and eventually understand the unfolding of ourselves over time, of matter and energy into life and our senses. We are the descendants of an entire line of beings that goes all the way back to the first cells, billions of years ago. Truly humbling if you take the time to think about it. Countless species, countless generations, countless individuals, each unique, valuable, worthy, seeking to survive, to flourish, in a world that barely comprehends itself. All the pleasures and pains, joys and tribulations of every being for billions of years, along an unbroken line that survived long enough to reproduce. All of them led to us. We are a part of that story of life, and that story is just a tiny part of a much bigger story of existence. The story of life continues, and we, right now, are part of that unfolding. This is the third episode of our four-part series that tells the backstory for the Evolution of Civilization series. This tells a new creation story, one based on verifiable evidence from overlapping methodologies, so that we can see into the heart of nature and uncover a much deeper and richer story for a new generation. After the rise of elements in our previous episode, we turn to the truly magical world of our own being, of our own ancestry, of our relatives throughout the kingdom of life, plant, animal, fungi, bacteria, and everything else, connected by DNA and many other processes, connected by the will to live, to grow. The story told here is primarily the story of the path that led to us, rather than an exhaustive tale about all of life's variations. A humbling story that should go a long ways to helping us realize the profoundness of our own existence. That right now is the miracle of all miracles, just as it always is when we notice it and experience it. This is the story of the structure of life and the fundamental framework that led to us, like why we have arms and legs and why all of our senses are located at one end of our body, our head. This is certainly one of the most exciting times to live, when we know where we came from. We know the major steps that life has taken to arrive at us. Life could have begun here or begun elsewhere. If elsewhere, it could have happened long before the Earth, which is 5 billion years old. Regardless, life was able to flourish on this rock for many reasons, beginning with the sun in our solar system. This rock that we call the Earth is not too close to that giant fireball and not too far away. And it's not too hot and it's not too cold. Also, our star is small enough not to burn all of its energy too quickly, thus giving planets enough time for life to form and evolve. And we also have some large planets that suck up much of the debris floating around in space, like Jupiter and Saturn. Although there is plenty out there that has already disrupted life, it is far less than it could have been, which could have prevented life altogether. Let's take a quick look at our entire genealogy from the beginning to now, and then we'll go back over it a bit slower. We began with self-replicating cells. Then a nucleus formed with other cellular machinery around 2 billion years ago. Then we became multicellular beings, where worms emerged and developed a left and a right side. Then with fish and the backbone, we developed a front and a back, about 600 million years ago. Then came amphibians and reptiles with 4 limbs, around 400 million years ago. 4 limbs is a practical body type that allows for fast locomotion on land. Then mammals emerged around 200 to 300 million years ago, defined by hair and mammary glands and being warm-blooded. Then primates came around 100 million years ago. Great apes, 15 million years ago. Then humans came about 3 million years ago. And modern humans, 200,000 years ago. And civilization as we know it is 10,000 years old. This is the basic path that we evolved on. And these are our most common ancestors. And what a path it's been. One that we are only now able to really appreciate when we take the time. And that time spent is repaid in great appreciation for what makes us what we are, who we are, why we are, right now. This is why it's important. This is what informs our new creation story. Life as we know it can be divided into 4 large groups that are essential: DNA, RNA, proteins, and carbohydrates. I won't go into detail about them, but wanted to mention them, and also briefly talk about DNA. DNA appears in at least 2 different configurations: long and spread out, and small and condensed, where it forms into chromosomes. It's likely the most complicated molecule that's ever existed. It has enough code to go to the moon and back 500,000 times. All of life comes from one common ancestor that began to replicate itself. That is one of the most remarkable facts ever discovered. We are the descendants of one bacterial cell that was able to copy itself in order to sustain its life beyond its own, to have the ability to evolve over time into all the life forms that have ever existed, including us. What led to this was microscopic chemicals, what we call amino acids. They formed into chains, thousands of them, each unique, that we call proteins, which is what DNA is. At some point, these proteins began to replicate themselves inside something that we call a cell. Every cell is a complex living being that has many, many processes occurring at every second, from replication to repair, energy production to transferring information. Each cell a miracle unto itself. All cells are the same when they begin and later change into specialized cells. Some cells become brain cells, which live as long as we do. Most die after about a month. Some become white blood cells, which check all the other cells for damage and infections. Cells are the longest continued life form on Earth, perhaps even in all of existence, and we are the descendants of the first cell, whose DNA has lasted for billions of years. The most fundamental stage of the evolution of cells was to become a complex cell. Evidence suggests that one type of cell swallowed other cells and found that it could co-opt their function. One of these was a bacterial cell that could be used as a power station. We call this mitochondria, and mitochondria still has its own unique DNA. Another kind turned sunlight into sugar power, and another kind used oxygen to take that sugar and make it into usable power. So the original cell co-opted these other cells for its own purpose, and over time became much larger and more complex. Ever more complex molecules became ever more complex cells, which eventually became multicellular. This process happened over and over and over for 2 billion orbits of this rock around a giant fireball. During that time, cells changed slightly from generation to generation. We would all agree to the notion that we have cells, but I think it's more accurate and more interesting to say that rather than us having cells, cells have us. That trillions of cells are working in many combinations to form us, and we are along for the ride, or rather, we co-opted their functions, just like cells co-opted the other cells' mechanisms. And our consciousness took over the executive functions. That is really something. But unfortunately, we find ourselves without instructions. We've woken up in a storm without an operator's manual, and we've been discovering it bit by bit until now, like a blind person drawing a map out of the territory. Our new story, this one, is one of the first editions to have a wealth of knowledge informing it, making the story that much more significant and meaningful. We as humans begin with 100 billion cells and eventually grow into 10 quadrillion cells, each with a complete genetic copy, and each carries out a function which sustains our lives. There are a few hundred types of cells that make us up. They vary in size by many orders of magnitude. They are responsible for everything that happens to us, from our conception to our decomposition. Billions of them die every day. They are there during every thought and emotion, at every moment of growth, at every second. They make us who we are. Inside the cells are thousands of types of objects like proteins and enzymes, which do all sorts of work in every second. We lack an appropriate appreciation of these tiny machines, which make up our body and mind. We are the sum of them. There are 3 main types of life that have existed, each a type of cell. The first 2 were bacteria and archaeobacteria, which are similar, except archaeobacteria is genetically closer to us, meaning larger life forms that have cells with a nucleus called eukaryotes, the third and last type of life. In a sense, all there are is cells, and these cells work together to create various structures like organs and organ systems, which then make even larger, more complex structures like animals. But at their base, they are all cells. Microorganisms without a nucleus were the first living creatures on Earth, and remain the only type of life for billions of years. Cyanobacteria and green algae spread across the Earth and gave off oxygen as a waste product, and they continue to be the life forms that create most of the oxygen. Oxygen began being produced 2 billion years ago and then kicked into high gear about 1 billion years ago. As oxygen spread across the globe, the cells with the nucleus and other machinery like mitochondria thrived because they could utilize the oxygen. These new cells became much larger and allowed DNA to carry more information. At some point, the underlying components and mechanics of life had to transition into more complex life. One must ask why the transition and why the continuation. I'd imagine it's a lot like us now in one form or another. We found ourselves existing and decided it was pleasant enough to try and survive and adapt, to become better at something. Certainly the evolution of fear went a long way here, but along the way there must have been the opposite, something to strive for rather than just trying to get away. What's interesting is the tendency to sense in all the myriad ways possible, to sense oneself and the environment, whether it's intrinsic to matter and energy itself, who can say? But the more complex senses are profound, senses such as vibration detecting systems, that produce sight and hearing. Along this line of thought is the idea that all life is a sensing apparatus, that over its evolution it valued these senses so much that it internalizes the senses into forms of chemical memory. It's really a miracle to sense and to recall in our brains what we sensed before, what we saw and heard and felt. Our story of life picks up steam with complex organisms, which date back at least 600 million years ago. Plants have existed on land for as much as 1 billion years if you count algae, but the forest didn't emerge until 400 or 500 million years ago, just before animals came onto land. So imagine a landmass that was largely devoid of any substantial life, and then being taken over by algae and mosses and ferns and then trees. Both plants and animals had to deal with the new challenges on land, such as the major transition from not being soaked in water all the time. Trees and other plants made living on land for animals much more likely, as it provided many benefits like shelter and food. A major development in the evolution of plants was the seed, which came after the spore, a contraption that protected the DNA from the elements and had the ability to begin growing when the environment was fruitful. Seeds formed as early as 300 million years ago. Flowering plants began 150 million years ago. Today there are over 300,000 flowering species. Grasses evolved 100 million years ago and make up 10,000 different species, covering a quarter of the land. Estimates are that around 300,000 species of plants live on the planet today. Animals as we know them today, which reproduce sexually, began over 1 billion years ago. But before that, the first major life form in our evolution was the sponge. The sponge is the first and most distant ancestor. Other common ancestors include the sea anemone, mollusks, arthropods, jellyfish, and sea stars. Another group of animals, called insects, emerged in a separate line from us around 400 million years ago, including winged insects. There were many types of early amphibians and reptiles along our path which had different numbers of holes on their heads. One of them led to most of the animals we see around us, with 2 eyes, 2 ears, a mouth, and a nose. The reason why almost all animals today look alike, that is, they have a backbone, 4 limbs with appendages, a head at one end and a tail at the other, is due to our common ancestor that we call the tetrapod, which was among the first animals to crawl onto land. The descendants of the tetrapod include reptiles, birds, mammals, some fish, all from this type of being. This body turned out to be a convenient and valuable body type for animal life living in our environments. Instead of making another long list of the animals that we share common ancestry with, I'd like to cover our evolution via our senses. Our senses are how we know anything and everything. They are how we know we exist. They are responsible for us understanding the world and make it possible to maneuver about and manipulate our environment. An in-depth personal knowledge of our senses can really add meaning and substance to our reality. Senses include not only our 5 common senses, touch, taste, smell, hearing, seeing, but also include non-traditional senses like the sense of temperature, balance, of pain, sense of time. Other animals have senses like sonar, the ability to sense electric fields and magnetic fields, sense infrared and atmospheric pressure. Beyond this, plants have the ability to sense light, gravity, temperature, chemical changes, and orientation, all without having a nervous system. Beyond this, each of our senses are not only one single sense, but a large family of senses. Vision includes sensing not just white light, but color, infrared, ultraviolet. Visual detection of light began at least 700 million years ago, and eyes at least 600 million years ago. A reconstruction of our eye evolution begins with cells that sense light, which then evolve into a cup form with only one end open, which gives a greater differentiation between shadow and light. That transformation ends in a pinhole that focuses light to create a much more defined shape, followed by a lens that covers and focuses the light. Smell exists in most vertebrates. Therefore, it originated at least 700 million years ago, which is before the eyes or the brain. We developed this sense along with fish, amphibians, and mammals, although each of them took different trajectories. Touch is another sense that we share with vertebrates, with nerve cells that send sense information along the spinal cord to the brain. The brain originated at least 500 million years ago and is present in all vertebrates and many non-invertebrates, including insects, snails, worms. Another word for consciousness is awareness or sense of self, and we can therefore classify consciousness as a sense. The term consciousness is probably best described as an umbrella term, where it resides on a spectrum or even a series of spectrums with one overriding and common history, from wide and raw on one end of the spectrum to narrow and distinct on the other. Hearing was one of the last senses to evolve around 300 million years ago, and it began with internal ears in amphibians, and evolved further in mammals with a new ear bone. Mammals evolved in the midst of several major extinctions on Earth. There have been 5 major extinctions, with competing theories about each of them, from global climate change to changes in the mixture of gases in the atmosphere, to solar flares, and strikes from objects from space, which is now known to be the one that killed the dinosaurs. Each time, some survived, including the line that led to us. So our ancestors were the survivors of 5 major extinctions. A shame and also ironic that we are causing the 6th. Mammals began their journey with a relatively large brain and many highly evolved senses, like having superb sense of smell and hearing, and they can see in the dark. Therefore, we were superbly adapted to life on Earth from the beginning. We began as small mouse-like creatures after the Devonian extinction 350 million years ago, and remained that way until the Permian extinction 100 million years later, which killed 95% of life on Earth. Then primates emerged about 100 million years ago, which were set loose to dominate the world by another extinction which killed the dinosaurs about 30 million years later. Our next leap forward was with the great apes, which emerged around 15 million years ago, including hominids, chimps, gorillas, orangutans. Then the first type of human emerged around 3 million years ago. Modern humans emerged around 200,000 years ago. And civilization we know it is about 10,000 years old. And we, here and now, are the products of that entire lineage, which will continue with its own episode concerning our human evolution. These events and processes are what create our new story, our truly human story. It's a real honor to be able to tell this tale. All the joys and triumphs, trials and tribulations that were experienced by all the individuals in all the generations back to the beginning are what form this story. And the vast efforts by humans to try and understand who we are and what we are and where we came from amounts to giants standing on the shoulders of giants. This story only exists and becomes meaningful when we seek to retell it in new ways, this being one of those attempts. If you enjoyed this episode of Enlightened Society, please subscribe, share, and donate. Thank you.